This is where you have an emergency fund that is your friend. Okay, they need to agree that there will be an emergency fund. The friend needs to be reliable, so don't just show up out of the blue and be like, "Hi, I need this, give it to me now." Hi everyone, and welcome to Financial Zula, where we give you information, insight, and tips on just about any financial topic in and around Namibia and the world. Today's topic is emergency funds. So we'll be talking about what an emergency fund is, why an emergency fund is important, how to start your emergency fund, where to keep your emergency fund, how much of an emergency fund you need. We'll be talking about how to maintain it and when to use it. And then right at the end, I will give you tips on emergency funds. So stay tuned and let's get into the video. What is an emergency fund? So an emergency fund is exactly what it is. It's a fund that you have in case of emergencies, money that you're saving for a rainy day, money that you have readily available in case of an emergency. So this is the money that you would need for unplanned expenses, like if your car breaks down or if you need money to go to a hospital. So money that you haven't planned to use, but something comes up and then you need to use it. That is exactly what the emergency fund is for. Why is an emergency fund so important? Well, like we said, an emergency fund is a fund for a rainy day. So in case the rainy day comes, you would be sorted. You wouldn't have to worry about where do I get the money to solve whatever issue I have at that moment. You would have already had money saved up just for that kind of a situation. The second important thing about emergency funds is that you have the money available, so it takes away so much stress from you. It keeps you in a good or a stable mental state because you have the money available in case of your emergency, and you don't have to worry about where to get it, who you're going to get it from, because you would have already had that money. It also gives you freedom in making decisions in case of that emergency, because now you have the money available. You decide how much of it you're going to take. You decide how you're going to use it to solve the problem instead of having to worry about where to get it. And the final important thing is that you don't have to get credit in case of an emergency, which you have to pay back later with interest because you would have already had the money available for you. That's why an emergency fund is important. So where does one keep an emergency fund? Well, the options are a lot, and it's really up to you where to keep your emergency fund. But the important thing when you're deciding where to keep your emergency fund is you should remember that it is an emergency fund, and that means that it needs to be readily accessible. That means that you need to be able to get it when you need it. So when you decide where to put your emergency fund, you need to put it in a readily available place, like a savings account that you can quickly just transfer the money if you need it. Or if you are investing the money, you want to keep it in an investment that allows you to take it out at minimal penalties, or no penalties at all would be preferable. But what you need to remember about where to keep your emergency fund is it needs to be in a separate place from your day-to-day bank account, if it's a bank account, or your day-to-day money, if it's money, like cash. So you need to keep it in a separate place that's easily accessible still, but still in a separate place so that you avoid using your emergency fund for non-emergency situations. So how much should your emergency fund be? Your emergency fund really depends on your circumstances. So you need to first define what is an emergency, and then you need to decide from the time the emergency happens or the tragedy happens, how long will it take me to recover and get back on my feet? And then your emergency fund needs to be based on the timing that it will take you to get back on your feet and the amount of your living expenses that you have determined you will need in that time. So just to give an example of this, if you are a person that lives alone and you lose your job, you would want your emergency fund to be your rent or mortgage payment and your food and whatever other living expenses are important to you or you can't live without. And then you tally that up for a month and say, if I lose my job, it will take me 4 months to get another job. So my emergency fund needs to be 4 months worth of the time that I'm looking for a job, so that while you're looking for a job, you do not suffer, or you are not like breaking down because you don't have enough money. If you are a person that lives in a double income home, and say, let's take the same scenario, you lose your job, but you don't have to pay for 100% of the rent or mortgage, you don't have to pay for 100% of the food, and maybe the one thing that you will need to pay for is, in case your car breaks down, you need to maybe pay for the repair, then your emergency fund would be half of the rent that you pay, half of the food that you buy, and in case your car breaks down, that amount, and then maybe it will take you 6 months to get a job, then you would be saving up your emergency fund for 6 months, or your emergency fund needs to be 6 months worth of that expense. So it really depends. It's not a fixed formula thing where you're like, my emergency fund is this amount and I need to do it. And it's also, there's a bit of a confusion sometimes where people think it's 6 months worth of your salary. It's not necessarily what your salary is or what your income is. It is your living expenses, and it is what your emergencies are most likely to be. How does one maintain an emergency fund? So maintenance of your emergency fund takes discipline. So you need to be disciplined. You remember that an emergency fund is a goal, and you need to stick to your goal, stick to the purpose of your emergency fund. This is why having a separate account helps, because it helps you be more disciplined not to touch it, because if you can't see it, then you wouldn't really be tempted to use it. So out of sight, out of mind. And apart from discipline, you need to focus, right, and decide what is an emergency. This is why it's important to have known what constitutes an emergency before you start with your emergency fund, so that you know when to actually touch it. So you don't just touch it when you are in a shop and there's this great sale and you're like, okay, I have an emergency fund for my great sales. Unless a great sale is your emergency, which it shouldn't be, then you would want to know to stick to only the in case of emergencies that you have determined, and those emergencies are the only reason that you should be able to touch it. When should you use your emergency fund? Like I said earlier, you need to define what an emergency is. So you sit down with yourself and you say, an emergency is my car breaks down. Okay, that's an emergency. If your car does break down, then you can go into your emergency fund and use the money. So you go through a process of, you know what your emergencies are. When something happens and you need to touch your emergency fund, you go back and say, according to what an emergency is to me when I started this fund, is this an emergency? And then if it meets the criteria that you set, then you can use the money. If it's not an emergency according to that criteria, and it might be an emergency, like a real emergency that you might not have thought of, right, then you can use it. But you should try to stick to what you have defined as an emergency. Otherwise, you might end up using your money for a lot of unnecessary things that you shouldn't have used it for. Okay, so if you feel like, okay, you've reached your goal and you have your money that is enough in your emergency fund according to your goal, and you're like, okay, well, I used to put all this money in my emergency fund, but now I have reached my emergency fund goal, you can do the next thing, which is what you should be doing, which is investing that money in a higher return account. Thank you for staying all the way until the tips in this part of the video. Before we get into the tips, don't forget to subscribe to Financial Zula and like the video so that the video can be shown to other people that might be interested and get the same information that you have just gotten. So let's get into the tips. We are at the tips. This is my favorite part of the video, and that's why I have my notes out. So this is where I give you some tips on the topic that we just spoke about, and yeah, then we can run off and go watch another video. The number one tip that I have for emergency funds is when you look at the time value of money. So time value of money basically says that money loses value over time, and then people say if you keep your money in an emergency fund, then its value is lost even more because you're not getting enough returns on it, right? But I just want to remind you that an emergency fund is just that. It's an emergency fund. In case you run into a problem, then you have cash available to solve the problem fast and not have to worry about getting credit for it, and like we said in the beginning. So just a reminder that an emergency fund is just that. It's for emergencies. This is not an investment necessarily, kind of a fund, all right? Tip number 2 is to be disciplined with your emergency fund. I am emphasizing this a lot now in this video, but it's really important to be disciplined with your emergency fund because it's so easy to go off the tracks. It's so easy to spend that money, but you need to define what an emergency is, define your goal, and stick to it until you reach it, and only use it in case of your emergencies that you have defined. So discipline is so important with emergency funds. If you're not disciplined, your emergency fund will fail and you'll find yourself in a rainy day without having backup. Tip number 3 is that your unused money can go to an emergency fund. So if you have a budget and you've budgeted and then there's some money that is left at the end, or some money that you have at the end of the month that you haven't used, you can put that in your emergency fund just to have your emergency fund or reach your emergency fund goal faster, right? It really helps to just put all the extra money that you have, extra money that you weren't expecting to get, and you put it in there, your bonuses, whatever. It just helps to speed up the process of finishing your emergency fund so that you can have funds available to do other things like investments and other partying and vacation things. Tip number 4 is investing your money in a place where you can get it quickly. So what this means is it's not necessarily that it has to be like a savings account where you can quickly access it and then you're not really getting much return on it in that savings fund. It can also be in an investment account where you get a penalty for removing your money from that account. So what that means is that you are able to quickly access it still and solve your emergency immediately, but it still gives you a good return. So if you are able to do that, then you should do that. You're not restricted to putting your money in a savings account. So the final tip is one that a lot of you will really kill me for, but this is where you have an emergency fund that is your friend, okay? So the important thing about having your friend as an emergency fund is, number 1, you need to speak to that friend and they need to agree that there will be an emergency fund. That's number 1. Number 2, you need to agree on an amount to say, in case of emergency, can I borrow this much from you? And then your friend knows about it. Number 3, you need to be your friend needs to be reliable, so they should have the money when you need it. But you also need to be a reliable friend because you need to pay back the money when you say you should pay back. And number 4 is that you need to know when after the emergency you're going to pay the money back. So you need to agree on all that with your friend. So it's not a bad thing to borrow money from your friends in case of an emergency, but you need to speak about it with your friend before you can borrow the money. You can't just show up out of the blue and be like, hi, I need this, give it to me now, without ever having had an agreement with your friend. Okay, so thank you so much for watching the video all the way to the end, and we will see you in the next video.